Our ancient word this morning is from Genesis chapter 11, verses 1 through 9. Now the whole earth had one language and the same words. And as they migrated from the east, they came upon a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. And they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and fire them thoroughly." And they had brick for stone and bitumen for mortar. Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens, and let us make a name for ourselves. Otherwise we shall be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth." The Lord came down to see the city and the tower which mortals had built. And the Lord said, "Look, they are one people, and they have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing that they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Come, let us go down and confuse their language there, so that they will not understand one another's speech." So the Lord scattered them abroad from there over the face of the earth, and they left off building the city. Therefore it was called Babel, because there the Lord confused the language of all the earth. And from there the Lord scattered them abroad over the face of all the earth. Our contemporary word is the Tower of Babel by Orlando Ricardo Menes.
And we do have the recording.
We do have the recording. Okay.
Of the poet himself.
Bonjour everyone. This is Kimberly Glazer, author of Copper Yearning and Poem a Day guest editor for the month of November. I hope you enjoy today's offering, brought to you by the Academy of American Poets.
This is Orlando Ricardo Menes reading Tower of Babel. Praise be to God for confounding our tongues and scattering us into exile, like chaff in a stray wind, or the fig seed dropped by a green guaca on a hog plum. Confusion is sweetest chirimoya on a dry tongue. Hymns of disorder bring bountiful harvests in times of drought. And perhaps only cross eyes can see in chaos serene mandalas. I shout from the top of my Babel's tower, sown as a kapok tree. Blessed are the dialects, the patois, the argots, and the pidgins, the half-breed word hordes, the mongrel grammars, the Geechees, the Kalos, and ghost words, those hallowed languages gone dead, or worse, extinct because of genocide or conquest, or just time's erosion. Yet how we must mourn each one in our bones, hearts, spleens. Then join hands by the sea at dawn to chant their names in flames of Gumbo Limbo. Oh, so many to remember. El Molo, Mawa, Bashu, Koibala, Guanche, Calusta, Wichita, and the Taino of my own island, Kubanakani, whose words linger past the cyclones of our sadness, like flotsam chromosomes or castaway fossils with such beautiful ember as Barbacoa, Canoa, Fotuto, Hamaca, Iguana, Malanga, Tabaco, and Yucca. With these words I make machines of memory in flesh and marrow. With these words I glide and cleave the tidal waves of history. With these words I take root in the quicksands of diaspora.
Perhaps we don't need a sermon after that poem.
but I have some notes. When we read the Bible, we're often looking for some clear instructions of how to live, what to do and not to do. Sometimes we read and we try to find it there where that may not be what the story is about. Or is it? One thing we know about this passage of the story of Babel, is that there are many interpretations. There's one predominant one known to Jews and Christians and many people who have never read the Bible and don't affiliate with any religion. And that interpretation, maybe you know this one. I mean, think for a minute. When you hear Babel, what comes to your mind? That interpretation that I'm talking about says that the story of Babel tells us about human pride and human seeking after grandeur, seeking to inflate themselves, and about God punishing them for that. It's a judgment story by that interpretation. It's a story that explains our current situation where we have, as our poet told us, many languages in many places. We have that great diaspora of peoples. David Smith, in a recent article, said that this passage has created a scattered array of interpretations, with most of its detail disputable one way or the other. And further additions to this particular industry may risk achieving little more than adding to the confusion, which is a translation of that word Babel. So let us see for ourselves if we can find something here that speaks to us in this moment, in this time. There's one question I start with, which is this a poem? Is this a story? This Genesis 11, 1 through 9. Is this a story about them? Is this a story about other people? Or is this a story about us? It might shape what we see and how we read. And as I let you know about what some other folks have said about this passage, I think we can ask ourselves, for these interpreters, is this a passage about them, the others, or is this a passage about us? The interpreters who told us that this is a story against human pride were very much seeing it as a story about themselves. They understood their difficult circumstances as in part have coming because of their assumptions that they could do everything by themselves for themselves, that they did not need God, in their view, to live rightly and do the right thing. Whether they were tower builders or simply people trying to live their lives, trying to remind themselves that it's a good idea to take a moment and ask ourselves, in this situation, what is the right thing to do? And according to my understanding of God and of the universe and of what we as humans are called to grow into, what we as humans are called to do, what is the right thing here? I had a good time talking about this passage with a number of people this week. One conversation didn't go on long enough for me. I was talking with Gail Dorff, who's part of the Marin Organizing Committee, about ways our church might be more involved. And she's Jewish, she's a member of the temple over in Tiburon. And when I mentioned that my sermon this week was from Genesis, it was the Tower of Babel, she said, I love that story. And we launched into this conversation about the different ways that people are interpreting it. And we were just getting going when she said, yes, and brought us back to our business. I look forward to further conversations like that, where we share what we've heard from our contexts, from our readings and studyings and ways of life. This text does have a lot of cultural power. Most people have heard of the Tower of Babel somehow. And if we don't even know what the message supposedly was, we know it's sort of a bad thing. Ted Hebert wrote an article almost 20 years ago now where he said, we've misread this story entirely. Read it carefully, and you will see there is no talk of sin in that story. There's no word judgment. This is just a story that explains how we became so spread out over the earth, speaking so many different languages, and have such a hard time understanding each other. Now, I've oversimplified, I confess, but it's an interesting thought to think, have we read things into this story that were never there? Well, you can imagine someone coming out and staking such a strong claim about a passage we think we know, received a number of responses. Mostly that he had missed something, or he had misread something, or that he didn't understand what the symbols really signified. So, for example, if we read this story in the context of the Bible, in the context even of these first 11 chapters of Genesis, these chapters that we call the primeval stories, the stories that happened before we had writing and cities and so on. Stories imagining how did we get to where we are. We've heard two already this month, right? We heard Genesis 1, a creation story, let there be light. And we heard the story of Noah and the ark and the flood. Well, here we have a story that comes 10 generations after Noah and the flood. They've left the ark. They have settled where they are. They've tried to go on with lives. And God says to them, be fruitful and multiply, that's good too. Be fruitful and multiply, and spread over the face of the earth. And yet this story tells us of people who are fruitful and multiply, and they go to one place and they decide, we want to stay right here and make a place big enough for all of us. We want to stay together. We don't want to spread out over the earth. And so the reason that God perhaps confused their languages and spread them out, the reason for that was because God said, you didn't do what I told you, and now you will. I've paraphrased the writers. You can imagine the scholars have been more judicious in their choice of words, but perhaps this is a story that indeed tells something about who we are and how we got here. Those of us who study archaeology and anthropology and evolution know that the idea that there was ever one place where all the people lived and they all spoke the same language doesn't make any sense. It's not how we came to be humans. But we did come to be humans who want to be together. We want to stay together, live our lives together, build our cities together, take care of each other, sing together, even in harmony. So we're obviously not able to read this story as a literal story of what happened, right? We know it couldn't be, besides just talking about time before the people could write. Or let's think about where it was written down in this form, and why might it have been written this way. So scholars tell us that this version of the story, this version of all these stories, were compiled in this way, edited, maybe even reworded in this way, while the Israelite leaders, and especially their scribes, were in exile in Babylon. Now, Babel is the Hebrew word for Babylon, and so certainly any Hebrew speaker is going to hear this as a story about Babylon. And while, perhaps even before they went there, but certainly while they were there, these learned scholars and scribes encountered the Babylonian tales of how things came to be. And we know that a number of our biblical stories are echoes or refutations of those stories, saying, this is how we see it. And so this was perhaps then a story based on what's called the Enuma Elish, which is one of the main Babylonian stories, and about how the god Marduk established the city of Babylon and built a tower. So there are many references in this story that could be echoes of that Babylonian tale. And yet, that Babylonian tale is from the Babylonian point of view. Those Babylonians were saying, this is us. Now, the Israelite scholars, they said, okay, this is your story. This is about them. If we tell it from our point of view, maybe this story can be told a little bit differently. So perhaps this is a story about building an empire. It was the empire of Babylon that had defeated and captured the Israelites. And maybe this empire collapses. Now, this empire, we know that the Babylonians sought to have everyone speak the same language, one language, Aramaic, so that all the business, all the politics, all the decrees could be done in one language. So the Israelites were here in Babylon, speaking Aramaic, working in Aramaic, and wanting to go back to Judah, back to their own homes, and speak their own language. So maybe the Israelites read this story as, we're not stuck here forever. This is a story about how Babylon falls and we get to go home and speak our own language. And of course, there were other peoples in exile in Babylon at that time, and so they imagined all of the different peoples returning to their homes, their own cultures, their own religions, their own languages. So this then is perhaps a parable of judgment, but the judgment is not against all the people who were building the tower and the city, but against empire, against this force that wants everyone to submit to one authority, to do as that authority instructs, to leave behind their own points of view, their own languages, their own ways of understanding what is holy. And this is saying, well, we don't know when, but we know this is going to fall. You can imagine I resonated to that interpretation a little bit because I saw myself more in the place of someone trying to figure out how to live in a turned over world, and less as someone who's seeking to establish a monolithic government set of institutions, a monolithic rule. Now, we're very biblical here, but I want to go to another writer I encountered, Aaron Runyons, who wrote an article called Babel and the Fear of Same-Sex Marriage. And it turns out that, in the years maybe between 2005 and 2014, when she wrote this article, a number of conservative commentators had said that this story of Babylon, this story of building a city and a tower, this is a story of people operating on their own with no authority. All the people were equal. In fact, they call it sick egalitarianism. There was a sick egalitarianism among these people building the city and the tower. It was tyrannically neutral. There was no leader, they say. There was no one directing where things would go. And this state of sick egalitarianism leads to stagnation and to self-indulgence. And this was self-indulgence to build this city and the tower without leadership, according to these writers. And it was about too much pleasure and collectivity. And they associate this egalitarianism with same-sex relationships. But Runyons, who's drawing these writers together, says, well, here, the fear of marriage equality may actually be a fear of too much equality, too much democracy. This story has been read by a number of people over the centuries as a political theology. Martin Luther was famous for that. But I think more writers, more of the scholars at least, are going back and saying, this Tower of Babel story is what we would call a hidden transcript. Now, I love it when someone says that, because when I wrote my dissertation about ethics in agriculture, I went back to a political theory that says that oppressed people don't simply follow the instructions. They speak to themselves in language that the oppressors might not even understand is about them. This is called the hidden transcript. And so Professor Ronald Hendel wrote about this hidden transcript. And he said, this story is about them. It is oppressed people, the Israelites, retelling a Babylonian story so that they can show how this story exposes the Babylonian power structure and what will become of it. But he says, it's also about us. Because the Israelites in exile also saw themselves as in exile in part because they had not been faithful to the teachings of their tradition. Love God and love your neighbor. Feed the hungry. Care for the sick. Visit the imprisoned. Welcome the stranger and the alien. They had not been following those teachings. This was one of the reasons why they had been punished and taken to Babylon. So maybe this is kind of a story of mocking the Babylonians. You know, there was an interesting Mocking the Babylonians event you might have noticed this week when there was a comedian on TV who was canceled because he mocked the Babylonians. And we see that kind of effort going on in our own time to quiet the voices that object to the kinds of hierarchies that our fear of marriage equality people champion. For the people who wrote that interpretation, for them, we need hierarchy. We need religious hierarchy. We need political hierarchy. We need gender hierarchy. We need to control impulses toward too much pleasure, toward self-indulgence. And this can only be done when we operate properly in a hierarchical system. Now, you may not be surprised to know that the writers who were writing these ideas, one was a Catholic bishop, one a Catholic cardinal, one, and the others that she quoted, and there were more, of course, were leaders in conservative Christian traditions. We hear these arguments about the need for authority and following instructions, the need for us to subordinate ourselves to the proper ways of living. And we hear, not only here, do we hear this multi-layered, multivalent story, a story that can mean many things, and perhaps one thing for me today and one thing for me tomorrow. But one of the things it does remind us is that we need a good laugh. We need a good laugh. And throughout history, people have crafted stories of resistance that bring a good laugh. And that laugh brings us hope. It brings us to the recognition that nothing is permanent in a positive way, that we can change in our own individual lives, we can change in our communities, we can change in our political systems. And this ability to laugh and to hope, this is what helps us survive. It helps us survive in a situation where we can't know what is coming for us individually or even for us together. But we can know that when we draw on our traditions that say, welcome the stranger and the alien, visit the prisoner, care for the sick, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, house the homeless, when we follow those traditions, following those traditions brings us together in small communities, it brings us together across cities and towns, across counties, across states. Because when we follow our teachings, that's when we don't succumb, lose our soul, forget why we're here. Those are the times when our hope and our joy and our work for justice carry us through this moment, today, tomorrow, this week, this month, together. Amen.